Welcome to the Cover 2 Resources podcast series, a podcast series about addiction and addiction education. My name is Amy McNeil. I lost my brother Samuel to a heroin overdose on October 23, 2015. He was 28. As a family, we thought we were prepared to help Sam fight addiction, but we were painfully mistaken. My family founded Cover 2 Resources in memory of Sam. Our mission is to arm others with the knowledge needed to best support a loved one struggling with opioid addiction. The Cover 2 Resources podcast is an ongoing series in which we interview experts in the fight against opioid addiction. It is made possible through donations and sponsorships from concerned individuals or organizations. If you want to help in the fight against opioid addiction, please consider donating or sponsoring the Cover 2 podcast. Go to cover2.org for more information. This podcast is available on iTunes, Google Music, Stitcher, and via RSS feed. Simply search for the full name, Cover 2 Resources, on your platform of choice. Thank you for listening.
Hi, this is Greg McNeil, founder of Cover 2 Resources. In a growing number of arrests and overdoses, law enforcement officials say the drugs are being bought online. Internet sales have allowed powerful synthetic opioids such as fentanyl to reach living rooms in nearly every region of our country as they arrive in small packages in the mail. Here to talk about the internet, the new drug dealer fueling the opioid epidemic, and what's being done to stop drug traffic on the internet is Mike Tobin, Community and Public Affairs Specialist with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Cleveland, Ohio. So Mike, welcome.
Thank you, Greg.
Okay. So, Mike, in 2013, Silk Road was taken down by authorities who believed they had stopped sales of illicit drugs on the dark web, where buyers could shop anonymously using special browsers and Bitcoin to make their purchases. Can you tell us a little bit about how that marketplace works and how it was shut down?
Sure, Greg, and thank you for having me and for your attention in this issue and opioids in general. Silk Road was an online marketplace. We in law enforcement, I should say we as consumers, love the internet. We can get our groceries online, and we can stream movies online, and I can hear a concert on YouTube, a day after it happens. But just as all of us people with good intentions have flocked to it, so have people with bad intentions. We've seen that as it relates to child pornography. We've seen it with ISIS as a recruiting tool, and certainly we've seen it with drugs.
And from a law enforcement perspective, the internet, the regular internet, is probably a beautiful thing for you because it's so traceable.
It's traceable. People leave their digital fingerprints. There's all sorts of cases where we just download some information and you make the case that way. The way the old gumshoes would dust for fingerprints, we get digital fingerprints.
Sure, social media, it's all over.
Exactly, and including gangsters flashing their guns and stolen money on Facebook. The dark web is somewhat different. It's for those who are seeking anonymity, people who don't want you to know what they're looking for, what they're buying, and basically anything is for sale on the dark web. That includes sex, that includes stolen goods, that includes drugs, and so. The way investigators were able to crack that is the way they have sort of always done cases, where they assume an identity and sort of go undercover. But instead of being undercover, posing in a neighborhood as a drug purchaser, they're posing online as people purchasing drugs.
So completely anonymous.
Correct. These are federal law enforcement agents posing, playing a role essentially, and from there, then they can start to try and trace the money. But again, the internet, as everyone knows, is global. So it's not a matter always of doing a case in Ohio and finding something in Massachusetts, although that's one case we'll talk about. We're finding cases in Bulgaria, in China, in the former Soviet Union, all over the world. And so then the question becomes, how do you get those people? What is our relationship with their diplomatic corps? Is there an extradition treaty? So it's very labor intensive. It's very time consuming, and sometimes you have great results, and sometimes you're just sort of a mouse going down a maze.
So this Silk Road was the biggest out there, and they really made a splash, and they thought that the market would be, kind of taken care of. Your job would be done there. And then this other, by the name of, I guess it was Alpha Bay, sprung up right after that.
Correct. And this is not unusual in law enforcement with drugs or anything else. You take down one organization and another one pops up. I mean, essentially, these people are filling a demand. Maybe it's a demand that we wish wasn't there, a demand we need to work together to reduce, but they are supplying a demand. And we've seen that with our drug cases going back 30 years. You take down a cocaine dealer, it dries up the supply of cocaine for a weekend or a month, but then somebody fills that void. And so, yes, Silk Road was taken down, Alpha Bay was taken down. We do these cases because it's important to do them, but we don't have any illusions that it will eradicate the problem. It will help improve it, but it won't eliminate it.
Oftentimes, it's just a temporary improvement, and then it kind of goes back, right?
I think that's accurate. We take down bad guys who are breaking the law, and in a lot of cases lock them up. But it doesn't change the fact that there are people who want to buy drugs,
huge demand,
or want to pay for images of children being raped, or all sorts of, or people who are drawn to terroristic ideology. It's a Band-Aid, but it doesn't take care of the root problem.
Unlike heroin and prescription painkillers, which are relatively bulky, you can fit enough fentanyl to get 50,000 people high in a standard first-class envelope. When I read that in one of the articles you sent me, that blew me away. How do you fight that, Mike?
Greg, that's a great question. I mean, the internet has been, we talk about disruption, technologies that disrupts things. I used to work at a newspaper. There aren't that many newspapers anymore. One time there was a guy who made wagon wheels, and then the Model T was invented, and we didn't really have a need for wagon wheels. So history is full of times where technology advances and it changes the marketplace. And we're seeing that right now in the drug trade. It used to be here in Cleveland and throughout the United States, the way drugs got here is they would often come over the southwest border. They would be driven up to a bigger city like New York or Chicago, and then they would be transferred here to Cleveland, and people would go buy them on street corners. What we're seeing now is people can order their drugs online, often on the dark web, but not always, sometimes just through regular Google. And it's being mailed here because, as you said, it's small, it's not easily traceable, and we get tens of millions of packages every year from overseas. So we could theoretically search every one of those packages, and then people would be upset because the thing they ordered from Amazon took 8 days instead of 2, and we would bring the economy to a screeching halt. Or we can use our best investigative methods to try and figure out what's coming in here, but knowing full well that we're not going to get every single thing or even most things.
So Senator Brown and Portman put together some proposed legislation to invest in some equipment, monitoring equipment, at our borders that would enable them to detect fentanyl coming in. What are your thoughts on that? Well, and just to throw a question off the page, not part of our... Yeah.
Well, we here at the Justice Department cannot comment on legislation. We enforce the laws as they're written by Congress, so we defer to Congress to write the laws. Certainly, we in law enforcement are looking for whatever tools we can get our hands on to try and stem the tide, but I will leave the legislation to the legislators.
Got it. Yeah, very wise. This summer, the DEA agents busted a suspected Chinese fentanyl dealer by the name of Bin Wang in Massachusetts, who was selling to buyers in Ohio. And in fact, I understand that one or more people died directly as a result of him dealing fentanyl to them. So can you tell us a little bit about that case and why, Mike, it was so significant?
Sure. It's a great example of law enforcement working together collaboratively to stem the tide, but also the challenges we face. The roots of this case go back to March of 2015 in Akron, when a couple of people died tragically. They took fentanyl and they died, and Akron police did a great job. They searched the scene as, this is a change in law enforcement. Years ago, if someone died of an overdose, you would just call the the coroner and have them taken away. Police now are searching it as a murder scene, looking for clues, looking for evidence. And in this case, they found evidence. They found a baggie that Thomas Rao, who's the gentleman who died, that had the heroin in it, and they ran it for fingerprints and found a fingerprint of a guy named Leroy Steele through a law enforcement database. Look at Leroy Steele. They knew who he was. They knew he was a known drug dealer in the Akron area. Started investigating him. Brought in the DEA. Were able to see through Mr. Steele's phones eventually that he was ordering the fentanyl directly from China. His phone was linked to a Gmail account, which is how they were able to trace the purchases. Steele and his girlfriend go on the run. They were under federal indictment, but didn't know it, but I suspect they knew law enforcement was closing in. And they were arrested in 2016 trying to cross over into Canada. But backing up a little bit, the companies that Steele was ordering the fentanyl from, that then gave DEA agents an idea of somebody to look at. And so, like we talked about earlier, DEA agents go undercover. They assume an identity. They figure out the lingo and the jargon, and they begin ordering fentanyl and carfentanil and all the fentanyl analogs from these companies in China. Now, it's really probably just one or two companies, but they change their names every so often, which is one of the challenges. Mm-hmm. But in this case, they are tracking the packages because they're shipped here by UPS and FedEx and all the carriers. And they realize that while some of the packages, like in Steele's case, were going directly to him in Akron from China, in other cases, more of them were going to a warehouse in Boston for a chemical company. So they start looking at that company. And it's, this sort of gets into law enforcement playing a cat and mouse game, like you've seen in The French Connection or any other movie.
Sure, fascinating.
The shippers in China realize that if they send it to the warehouse in Boston, which is a chemical company, that may not raise red flags because it would be logical that chemicals are going from China to a chemical company in Boston. Yeah. Well, of course, the chemical company is just a front. It's just a domestic shipping point. So they would send the drugs from China to Boston, where a guy named Bin Wang, who's a Chinese national who was living in Massachusetts, would then take the drugs, repackage them, and send them throughout the United States, including here in Ohio.
Wow. And they're small enough where it's not a red flag.
Right. It's
the packages.
Somebody's and of course when they're ordering it, the undercover or the customers, they're not saying, "Hey, send me fentanyl." There's codes that have always existed as it relates to drugs, but so it's sort of surreptitious. They're speaking in code, and they're trying to minimize risk. They're trying to make it look like this is just a normal transaction, and they're banking on the fact that there's so many packages going at all times that we're not going to find it. So this case in particular has drawn a lot of interest because it's the first time we've been able to make a direct tie to China, to a company that we're able to trace it. So we have, there's prosecutors all over the country trying to figure out, well, did the drugs in their district come from this warehouse in Boston as well? So it's a great success for us, but again, like Silk Road, like Alpha Bay, we don't harbor any illusions that because we've cut off this one head of the hydra that the problem has gone away. We'll pat ourselves on the back for 30 seconds and then get back to the next case.
How about getting to the people in China that run that operation? What's his name? Gordon Gin?
Gordon Gin, which we believe is
a great name.
A pseudonym playing off of the brand Gordon Gin. We don't think that's his actual name. As best we know, he's in China. The investigation is ongoing. Whether Mr. Gin ever sees a U.S. courtroom is an open question. But again, this goes to the challenges. We're dealing with someone who is literally half a world away in a country where I don't think it's a secret that there are diplomatic challenges right now going on between the United States and China, and there are equities involved, and it's the State Department will figure out how to prioritize this.
Okay, so the Plain Dealer published an article that's titled "Risking Death. Testers Become Guinea Pigs for Heroin Dealers' Lethal Doses." Can you tell us a little bit about that practice?
I can tell you what I know about it. And the idea of testers, surprisingly, is not new. Heroin dealers have been doing it for a long time, going back to, there's a scene in The French Connection where they sort of show how that happens. Obviously, when people get drugs, it's not like getting it from Whole Foods or Walmart. There's not a list of ingredients. There's not a certification of what's in it. So the drug dealers will typically use what we call testers. They're people who they know who will do the drugs for free. These are people typically badly in addiction. And then they will report, it's high quality, it's low quality. And the dealer then will figure out, A, how to price it, and B, how much he can cut it or step on it or dilute it. So while the idea of using testers isn't new, what is new is the level of lethality that we're seeing. These are folks, in Leroy Steele's case, who are getting the drugs shipped from China. And our experience is they don't know exactly whether it's heroin, whether it's fentanyl, whether it's carfentanil, whether it's any of these derivatives. And so the tester is putting something in their body that can very easily kill them on the first try. If being a tester is akin to playing Russian roulette, being a tester in this day and age with all these dangerous drugs is like playing Russian roulette with 5 bullets in the chamber.
And it seemed, by the way that the article in the Plain Dealer conveyed it, it seemed just so almost arbitrary what the dealers are doing in terms of they're sitting around at a kitchen table and mixing up this concoction and then giving it to their tester who gets their drugs for free.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I mean, this is, they are human guinea pigs. This is a science experiment where the person in charge of it doesn't really care about the person using the drug. They're just in it for the money. All drug dealers are, but this really sort of takes it to a new level. They're sort of playing mad scientist, and then the tester is there to see, if they can survive it or how to price it. It's hard to get your head around because it just shows such a lack of concern for fellow human beings.
Human life.
Absolutely.
Sure. Yeah. So really interesting about this article is the fact that it goes on to link the dealer that you mentioned, Leroy Steele, to that practice because his tester was the gentleman that the article revolved around, and he was at the center of the case that you spoke about earlier.
That's right. John Caniglia from the Plain Dealer did a great job of sort of diving into the details. In this case, the tester was a gentleman named Brian Stallnacher, 48 years old from the Akron area, father of 6, who knew Leroy Steele from past business dealings. And Mr. Stallnacher battled alcoholism and addiction to heroin. But what we found and what John's reporting bears out is that Stallnacher worked for Steele as a tester. And, of course, Leroy Steele is serving 20 years in federal prison. He's someone that we were able to prove was importing large amounts of drugs from China and selling it all around the Akron area. Steele is convicted of causing one death, but we believe he's linked to several more. And like I said, he's doing 20 years in prison. His girlfriend is serving 10 years.
Wow. So, and his girlfriend said that they were the first to use this stuff and never had to pay. So they just mixed it up and passed it right over to him. Sure,
that's not uncommon, where drug dealers will give drugs for free. And I would be using air quotes. I mean, nothing is free. Stallnacher's putting his life in the hands of Steele, and we know how that ends for Mr. Stallnacher. But yeah, Leroy Steele would give the drugs for free to his tester, who then would presumably report back the purity of the drug. So Steele then knew how much he could cut it, how he could price it, that sort of stuff.
Wow. That's just unfathomable, unbelievable.
Right. I mean, like I said, the idea of testers is not new. We've seen that in heroin cases going back at least 15 years. But this is just so dangerous because the people have no idea of what they're taking. People have no idea what they're buying. Dealers have no idea what they're getting. They're ordering something online. It's coming in the mail from China. But like I said, it's not like the grocery store where you take it back and say, oh, this isn't exactly what I ordered. You're at the mercy of somebody half the world away who you have no idea who they are. And that, I think, is in large part what's driving this huge increase in deaths we've seen in the last couple of years.
Yeah.
Where all the standard rules that govern the drug trade, informal rules, have sort of gone out the window.
So back a couple of months ago, we heard an NPR report about a fentanyl test strip that they were using in the Bronx, St. Anne's, corner of harm reduction. And they were actually giving out these test strips along with syringes on the syringe exchange truck. And what they found is that users were 10 times more likely to change their usage habits when they use that test strip on their stuff prior to usage. In other words, it's not that they didn't not use it, but they went a little slower and took their time in a smaller dose. Do you have any comment in terms of the keeping users safe and harm reduction as it applies to this and having something out there that would cost a buck per test strip versus human testers?
Sure. In my job, I've come across lots of different people who are trying to come up with ways to turn the tide on this epidemic. And as you know, Ohio is the leading state in the nation for the numbers of deaths from heroin and opioids. And what I've heard from a lot of people is we are in uncharted territory, and we need to try new things, try anything, to experiment. So if there are things out there that can help save lives, because that's really what we're talking about, then why not give it a try? Dr. Joan Papp at Metro Health says, the only time someone can't get treatment is if they're dead. And so if there are things out there that help us keep people alive long enough to stabilize them and get them into treatment, I don't see the downside.
President Trump declared the opioid epidemic a national emergency. What does that mean to you and the team of law enforcement officials and your ability to really respond to the epidemic?
The honest answer, and this isn't a criticism, but we don't know yet. And this has always been a question with these states of emergency. I think the governor was thinking about declaring one. My understanding is it will perhaps free up some more money on a variety of fronts for treatment, for prevention, perhaps for law enforcement. We've been in a state of emergency here in Cleveland for at least 5 years. Maybe not declared, but right. Here in the office.
As far as your modus operandi is concerned,
absolutely,
the way you address it.
We saw, and this will be no surprise to your listeners, but I remember when opioid deaths went from 40 in 2010 to 200 in 2012, and we thought, geez, what is going on here? We've never seen anything like this. Of course, now we look back on 200 deaths a year as, geez, things weren't so bad. I mean, it's 4 times as high now. We've got folks working around the clock on these cases, both on the prosecution side and on the investigative side, FBI, DEA, Cleveland Police, everyone you can imagine, and they just go nonstop. We have, there's Cleveland police officers who respond to every overdose now, going back to what we talked about, that now they're looking for clues or looking for evidence. Yeah. And those guys, we're about to hit Labor Day, and they've already gone out on 1,000 runs, fatal and non-fatal. So everybody's working around the clock. It's just a question of, how do we, it's a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true. We cannot arrest our way out of this problem. So we will do all we can on the law enforcement side, but at some point we have to rein in the demand, and that opens up a whole bunch of other questions as to how we do that.
So what final thoughts do you have for our listeners about the opioid epidemic and protecting our borders from drugs entering the country?
Well,
That's really two questions,
right.
And pretty big ones.
Right. I'll leave the second part of it again to the folks in Washington who are fighting that out. But I will, whenever I think of this problem, I think of the interview that El Chapo gave with Sean Penn. As a former reporter, I'm bummed I didn't get that exclusive. But Sean Penn asked El Chapo, for those who aren't familiar.
It's quite a risky exclusive. That was just amazing. And that came out of nowhere, didn't it?
Yeah, give us the background on that whole thing, because I vaguely remember it. Walk us through that.
Well, I mean, El Chapo is the leader of the Sinaloa cartel, a multi-billion-dollar international drug organization that uses violence to enforce its will. This is a huge company with its own army that is responsible for a heck of a lot of the drugs that have flowed into this country over the last probably 30 years. And El Chapo has been arrested numerous times and always broken out, in part because thought he has people on the take in Mexico.
Just amazing, though, some of the ways that he's broken out.
Sure, right.
Long tunnels.
Right.
Yeah.
But before he was arrested again, the most recent time, and he's now been extradited to the United States and presumably will not get free this time, the actor Sean Penn was able to get an interview with him in Mexico and asked him, how does this end? When does this drug trade end? And Guzman, which is his real name, said, there will be no more supply from us when there is no demand in the United States. We have a cultural and societal problem in this country, and law enforcement can take down all the warehouses in the United States, but until there's a decrease in demand, we won't be able to turn the tide on the problem. And we live in a country where I will watch a Browns game next week and be inundated by commercials either to get me to buy beer or to ask my doctor to prescribe me a pill to take care of one of 1,000 afflictions that I probably didn't even know I had and probably don't have. This specific epidemic is inextricably tied to a massive increase in the amount of painkillers that were prescribed in this country, which companies got paid a lot of money to sell. And just like the guys who died in Akron that we talked about earlier, they started on prescription painkillers. We have to break that cycle. We have to be willing to endure a little pain if we need to. For years, people were able to survive wisdom teeth extractions with Tylenol and popsicles. They didn't need the 20 Vicodin that I got 20 years ago. So I just think we need to do a better job of talking to our children and preventing them from getting hooked on drugs and understanding that just because a doctor gives it to you doesn't mean there are no downsides. We need to certainly get treatment for people who want it and who are open to it. We need to, again, change the prescribing practices, and we in law enforcement will continue to do what we've been doing for, going back 50 years, which is trying to take these guys off one at a time. But until we reduce the demand, we're going to struggle to do that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks, Mike. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
We've been visiting today with Mike Tobin, who is the Community and Public Affairs Specialist with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Cleveland, Ohio. My name is Greg McNeil, the founder of Cover 2 Resources. Thank you for listening to this Cover 2 PPT podcast. That's people, places, and things making a difference in the opioid epidemic.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Cover 2 Resources podcast. This episode is a production of Cover 2 Resources and is made possible by listeners like you. With your support, the Cover 2 team can continue to research and broadcast these resources to others in need. If you'd like to donate or to sponsor a future podcast, please visit cover2.org. As always, thank you for listening. Together, we can make a difference in the opioid epidemic, one life at a time.